The wind howled across the snow-covered fields, cutting through the tiny village like a sharp knife. Every roof was buried under thick layers of snow, and the trees stood silent, frozen in the icy winter. Smoke rose slowly from chimneys, but it brought little comfort. Fear had crept into every home. The villagers whispered in small groups, eyes darting to the forest paths, listening for the distant sounds of marching soldiers. Among them lived a man who, at first glance, seemed ordinary. He was a farmer, quiet and simple. His hands were rough from years of work, his face lined by the sun and cold, but there was a calm in his eyes that made people pause. Unlike others, he did not join the discussions about fear or the hopelessness of the village. He kept to himself, tending his small farm, fixing fences, and feeding his few animals. The villagers called him the Quiet Man, and most of them never really knew him. Some thought he was shy. Others said he was strange, too calm in times of danger. But the farmer did not care about gossip. He had something else on his mind, something the villagers could not yet see. The Soviets had been moving closer every day. Reports came from nearby towns, soldiers with heavy boots and cold eyes, taking over villages, burning what they could and killing anyone who tried to resist. Panic spread quickly. Families packed what little they could carry. Children clung to their mothers, and the elderly huddled near the hearth, praying silently for safety. One cold morning the farmer stepped outside. His breath formed white clouds in the freezing air. He looked over the horizon where the forest ended and the road began. Far away the sound of marching reached him, a rhythm that chilled the heart. A small group of Soviet soldiers appeared, their red coats dark against the snow. They laughed and shouted, unaware that eyes were watching them from the shadows. The villagers ran inside when they saw them. Doors slammed. Windows were locked. Fear was stronger than courage. No one dared step out. No one dared to fight. The farmer, however, remained still. His eyes followed the soldiers carefully. He watched how they moved, how they walked, where they placed their feet, and how they carried their weapons. Every little detail mattered. Another day, another group of invaders, he muttered quietly to himself, his voice barely more than a whisper. He walked slowly to the barn, brushing snow from the roof. Inside, he touched the walls and beams, feeling every knot of wood, every corner that could hide a trap. A small smile formed on his lips. He had a plan. No one in the village knew what he was thinking. They assumed he was just another simple man, tending his farm while danger roamed freely outside. But the farmer was not simple. He was clever, patient, and brave in ways that could not be measured. He had been thinking about this moment for months, preparing quietly while others panicked. The Soviets marched closer each day, believing the village would fall without resistance. They were confident, arrogant even. They did not notice the small changes the farmer had made. A broken fence that could hide a pit, a pile of hay that could block a path, a cleverly placed log that could trip an enemy. To the soldiers, it all seemed like a normal farm. But to the farmer, every detail was part of a bigger plan. That evening the wind rose stronger and snow began to fall again. The farmer stood by his small window looking out at the empty path. His animals were safe in the barn, but his mind was already in motion. He imagined the soldiers walking straight into his traps, surprised and confused, never knowing where the danger would strike first. He remembered the words of his grandfather, a man who had survived hardships long ago, "Courage is not loud. It is quiet like a shadow. But it can strike harder than the strongest army." The farmer had carried those words in his heart all his life. Now they guided him. Night fell, covering the village in darkness. The villagers slept uneasily, dreaming of soldiers and fires, unaware that their fate might soon change. The farmer, however, could not sleep. He moved silently around his home and barn, checking his preparations again and again. Every trap, every hidden path, every clever idea had to be perfect. As the moon rose, casting pale light across the snow, the farmer stepped outside one last time. The village was quiet, too quiet. He looked at the forest line and the road beyond. Somewhere out there the soldiers were coming. They thought they would conquer easily. They thought no one would resist. The farmer smiled, a small, confident smile. He held a shovel in one hand and a piece of rope in the other. Not weapons that could match the Soviets in strength, but tools of intelligence, patience, and cunning. The quiet man had a plan that no army could imagine. And so, as the wind howled and snow fell heavier, the village waited in silence. Nobody knew what was coming. Nobody knew that one man could change everything. One simple farmer, quiet and unassuming, had a secret that could turn fear into triumph. No one thought a single farmer could stop hundreds of soldiers. But he had something in mind. The morning sun rose pale and weak over the snow-covered village. The air was sharp, cold enough to sting the farmer's face as he stepped outside. Today the quiet man would no longer just watch. Today his plan would begin. From the small hill behind his farm he observed the soldiers. A group of about 20 had entered the village the night before, spreading fear and shouting commands. They walked with heavy boots that crushed the snow underfoot, their weapons slung carelessly over their shoulders. To the villagers they seemed unstoppable. To the farmer they were walking exactly where he wanted them to go. For months he had prepared. Hidden pits lined with sharp stakes, covered by a thin layer of snow. Logs arranged to trip the unsuspecting. A small creek bridged with loose planks that could collapse at the right moment. Every trap was simple, ordinary, invisible to the soldiers. But together they would become a deadly surprise. He moved silently among the barns, checking each trap. His hands worked quickly, making small adjustments here and there. Every detail mattered. A branch shifted slightly, a plank moved a little. Nothing noticeable to the untrained eye, but deadly for those who walked blindly. The first soldiers he wanted to target were patrolling near the creek. They laughed and joked, speaking in their harsh language. One kicked a stray log, unaware that it was a part of the farmer's trap. Another soldier tripped over a hidden rope. The farmer watched carefully from the shadows, holding his breath. Then he saw the perfect moment. The soldiers approached a shallow ditch he had prepared. Hidden under snow, it looked like solid ground. The farmer nudged a small stone with his foot. It shifted slightly, signaling the trap was ready. He stepped back, staying hidden among the trees. The soldiers moved forward confidently. Step by step they walked right into the ditch. Snow gave way and suddenly several men fell into the hidden pit. Shouts and screams echoed through the village. The farmer stayed still, watching as confusion spread among the soldiers. Those outside the pit rushed to help, but more logs and ropes tripped them. Chaos erupted, and the villagers peeked from their windows, astonished at what they saw. The farmer smiled quietly. He did not celebrate, but inside, his heart beat with a sense of satisfaction. One group of soldiers had been stopped without a single direct fight. His traps were clever, his knowledge of the land more powerful than brute force. By midday he had repeated the trick with another small group. A pile of hay was pushed carefully near the road. As soldiers walked past, the farmer pulled a hidden rope. The hay collapsed, blocking the path and causing panic. Horses stumbled. Guns fell. Soldiers fell into the snow, tangled and confused. The villagers whispered about the mysterious shadow that haunted the soldiers. Some thought it was a spirit. Some thought it was a secret army. None suspected the quiet farmer, tending his small farm, watching from the edge of the forest. As the day passed, the farmer became more daring. He set small fires in empty barns, forcing soldiers to chase the flames while slipping on ice hidden under snow. He used smoke and confusion to his advantage. One by one, soldiers were delayed, trapped, or injured without understanding why. The farmer had not fought directly, yet he had struck terror into their hearts. In the evening he returned to his small home, brushing snow from his coat. Villagers stared at him, curious but afraid to speak. They had seen the chaos caused by the morning's events. Some even dared to whisper, "Could it really be just one man?" The farmer sat quietly by the fire. He did not speak of his actions. He only planned the next day. The first strike had been a test and it had worked perfectly. The Soviets were confused. They were shaken. And they did not know who was behind it. At night he walked again through his traps, checking each carefully. He adjusted small things, sharpened stakes, and moved logs slightly. Preparation was everything. A single mistake could mean death, not for him but for the villagers. Far away, the remaining soldiers were reporting the strange events. Officers scolded them, calling them careless, unlucky, or cursed. None suspected that one quiet farmer, with no army and no advanced weapons, was behind their losses. The farmer's mind, however, was calm. He thought about the next group of soldiers, about how to lure them into traps even more cleverly. His strategy was simple. Never fight directly, always use the land, the snow, and their arrogance against them. Every trap was a lesson in patience, every small victory a step closer to a larger plan. Before sleeping he looked out at the village once more. Smoke from fires lingered in the distance. Soldiers were moving cautiously now, unsure where danger might strike next. Villagers were starting to believe that someone was protecting them. Someone unseen, clever, and patient. The farmer smiled quietly to himself. He had done what few could imagine. A single man had struck fear into an army. And this was only the beginning. Tomorrow he would strike again. And tomorrow the Soviets would not know what hit them. No one knew it yet, but the quiet farmer was becoming a nightmare for the Soviets. A man with nothing but his mind, his land, and his courage was about to change everything. The days grew colder and the snow in the village deepened, hiding secrets beneath its white blanket. The Soviets had begun to notice something strange. Every patrol they sent into the fields returned smaller than it should have, often bruised, confused, or missing men. They whispered to each other about invisible enemies, traps that appeared from nowhere, and strange misfortunes. The quiet farmer had become a ghost in their eyes, an enemy they could not see, and it terrified them. Inside his small house, the farmer listened to the wind outside and smiled faintly. He knew the soldiers would start thinking twice before stepping into his village. But he also knew that fear alone would not stop them. He needed to teach them a lesson they would never forget. The next morning, a larger group of soldiers approached. This time there were about 50, led by an officer with a sharp face and cold eyes. He had been sent from the city to investigate the strange failures of the previous patrols. The officer was confident, believing that a larger group would overpower any small resistance. He did not know that one man was already waiting, prepared to use his land as a weapon. The farmer watched from a hilltop, wrapped in a thick coat, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. He scanned every step of the soldiers, memorizing their formation. Every tree, every ditch, every frozen stream became part of his plan. Today he would show them that intelligence could beat strength. He moved silently to the first trap, a section of the forest where fallen logs hid a pit. The pit was shallow enough that it was invisible beneath the snow, but deep enough to trap an adult soldier. A rope stretched between two trees would make them stumble at just the right moment. Then, a pile of hay, carefully balanced, could topple onto them if needed. The soldiers marched closer, their boots crunching on the snow. The officer barked orders, telling his men to move faster, unaware that each step was leading them into danger. The farmer adjusted a small stick that would trigger the rope, testing the timing. Everything was ready. The first soldier stepped on the rope and tripped. He fell forward, crashing into the snow and sliding toward the hidden pit. A second soldier tried to help him, only to stumble over the same rope. Within seconds, several men fell into the pit, struggling to climb out. The officer shouted orders, but confusion spread quickly. Others stepped on logs and ice patches the farmer had prepared, sliding, tumbling, and crashing into each other. From the hill, the farmer watched carefully, making small adjustments here and there. A fallen branch redirected a soldier's path, a hidden pile of stones forced another into the snow. He had no weapons, no soldiers, only clever thinking and knowledge of the land, but it was more than enough. By midday, half of the soldiers were trapped, injured, or lost in the forest. The officer could not understand what was happening. He ordered his men to regroup, but every direction they turned led to more traps, more confusion. The farmer had predicted each move, anticipating their mistakes, using their own arrogance against them. Meanwhile, the villagers watched from behind locked doors and frosted windows. They whispered about the farmer, their hearts filled with awe. Some began to hope that perhaps they were not helpless after all. One brave woman muttered, "Could it really be him, the quiet man? Is he saving us?" The farmer did not stop. He moved silently among the trees, using hidden paths only he knew. He triggered small hazards, a falling log here, a tripwire there. Each action was precise. Each soldier's fall was calculated. By late afternoon, the once confident officer was exhausted, furious, and terrified. His men were scattered and broken, unable to fight effectively. The snow began to fall again, covering footprints and making the forest even more treacherous. The officer finally realized the truth: they were being outwitted. A single man, with no weapons but his mind and knowledge, had turned 50 trained soldiers into frightened children lost in the forest. The farmer's plan had worked perfectly. As night fell, the officer ordered a retreat. The remaining soldiers limped away, bruised and beaten in spirit. Rumors would later spread of a shadow in the snow, an invisible enemy who struck without warning. They would never know it was the quiet farmer, a simple man whose courage and intelligence made him a force of nature. Back in his small home, the farmer tended to his traps, adjusting them for the next attack. He checked the pits, the ropes, and the logs, ensuring everything was ready. Every detail mattered. He thought about the next patrol, the next officer, and the next plan. This was just the beginning. The villagers dared to step outside carefully, glancing at the fields and forests. They saw nothing, only the snow and the quiet farm. Yet they could feel a strange sense of protection, a presence that kept the soldiers away. Slowly, hope returned to their hearts. The farmer sat by the fire that night, staring into the flames. He did not speak of his victories. He only planned silently, knowing that more challenges would come. The Soviets would return in larger numbers, stronger and angrier. But he was ready. His traps, his knowledge and his patience were weapons stronger than any gun. And somewhere in the snowy forest, the officer who had returned to the city whispered a warning. The village, it is cursed. Something invisible, something clever. It kills our men. Beware. The farmer smiled quietly, a shadow moving in the dark. Outnumbered, the Soviets had learned their first lesson. Numbers alone could not defeat intelligence. A single man could be an entire army. No one in the village knew his name. No one knew his plan. But one thing was certain. He had already become the nightmare of the Soviets. And the war for the village was far from over. The village woke to an eerie silence the next morning. Snow had fallen thick and heavy, covering the marks of yesterday's chaos. The Soviets who had marched in were gone, retreating in confusion and fear. Yet the officer who led them would never forget the strange events. He returned to the city reporting with urgency and anger. They are clever, he said to his superiors, his voice tight with disbelief. I do not know how, but a single man, perhaps even more than one, has trapped 50 of our soldiers in the snow. Every move we make he is ready. It is impossible to fight someone so precise. But the city commanders were impatient and overconfident. 50 men is nothing, one officer scoffed. It is winter. It is mud and snow. There is no curse, only chance. Send more men. Crush the village, destroy the farmers. No one can stop us. They did not know that the quiet farmer in the village was already ready for them. He had anticipated the reaction. He had studied the patterns of the soldiers, their arrogance, their reliance on numbers. And he had prepared his next moves. Back in the village, the farmer walked through the fields, his boots sinking slightly in the soft snow. Every tree, every mound of earth, every frozen stream was part of his mind's map. He inspected his traps again. Pits hidden beneath snow, tripwires stretched along paths, logs stacked just so. A barn at the edge of the village was rigged to collapse if disturbed. Nothing was ordinary, everything had a purpose. The villagers watched him secretly, amazed by his calmness. Some dared to speak in hushed tones. Do you think he can stop more of them? A woman asked, worry in her voice. The farmer did not answer. He only nodded slightly and returned to his careful work. Words were useless. Action was everything. By midday, a larger force of Soviets appeared on the horizon. This time nearly 100 soldiers, led by a senior officer. They marched confidently, expecting the village to be an easy target. The snow made their boots heavy, but they paid it no mind. They laughed, shouted, and carried their guns with pride. But there was tension in their ranks. The stories of the previous attack had spread. They had heard whispers of a shadow in the snow, a man who struck without warning. The farmer observed from a distance, studying their formation. He noticed their movements, how they kept their lines, and where they relied on the village path. He saw exactly where to strike first. The first trap was simple but deadly. A section of the road had been carefully weakened under the snow. As the leading soldier stepped forward, the ground gave way slightly. Logs fell, snow tumbled, and soldiers tripped over one another. Confusion spread instantly. The officer shouted orders, but the snow and traps turned every step into danger. Then came the barn. The farmer had rigged it earlier without anyone noticing. A simple touch, and the barn's side wall collapsed partially, forcing a group of soldiers to dive into the snow to escape the falling beams. Panic erupted. Guns fell, horses bolted, and chaos spread through the village. The farmer watched calmly, adjusting small tripwires here and there, guiding the enemy without ever appearing in their sight. The Soviets could not understand what was happening. Each trap seemed random, impossible, like the village itself was alive and attacking them. The officer yelled furiously, trying to regroup his men. But his confidence was shaken. By evening, dozens of soldiers were injured, lost, or trapped. Their morale crumbled under the invisible threat of the farmer. The villagers, hidden behind doors and windows, began to whisper stories. They called him a ghost, a shadow, a protector sent by fate. Children peered out from behind curtains, amazed at the strange and clever defense. Some dared to leave small gifts at the edge of the forest, food and blankets for the quiet man who had saved them. The farmer, however, accepted nothing. He did not seek praise or recognition. His mind was always on the next move, the next trap, the next strike. Every detail mattered. Every mistake the soldiers made was his advantage. As night fell, the senior officer called for a retreat. He gathered what remained of his force and limped back toward the city. His face was pale, his hands shaking. He had seen something impossible. A single man, no army, no advanced weapons, controlling the battlefield through wit and preparation alone. In the city, reports of the disaster spread quickly. The commanders were angry and confused. How can one farmer stop hundreds of soldiers? They demanded. Find him. Crush him. This is an insult to the Red Army. But the quiet farmer was already planning. The next attack he knew would come larger, fiercer, and smarter. And he would be ready. He studied the incoming paths, prepared new traps, and thought through every possible move of the Soviets. His knowledge of the land, his patience, and his intelligence were stronger than their guns. The villagers began to understand one thing. Their protector was not a soldier, not a hero in the army, but a simple man with courage, brains, and patience. And yet, even they could not imagine the extent of his power. The wind howled again that night, covering footprints, hiding traps, and carrying whispers of the farmer's deeds. The Soviets had been shocked. They had underestimated a simple man, and it had cost them dearly. And still, the quiet farmer prepared, confident that the next day would bring another lesson, even greater than the first. The Soviets thought they were strong. They thought numbers and weapons were everything. But one man, clever and patient, had already begun to teach them the meaning of fear. The village was quiet in the early morning, but the air was thick with anticipation. The quiet farmer had proven himself. The Soviets had been trapped, confused, and humiliated. Stories of his cleverness had spread among the villagers, whispered in fear and awe. People no longer saw him as just a simple man. He was a protector, a strategist, a shadow in the snow that could outwit an entire army. But the farmer knew the truth. He could not fight alone forever. The Soviets would return in larger numbers, stronger and angrier. And when they did, the village needed more than one man. Slowly, carefully, he began to involve the villagers. It started with small tasks. A young boy would move logs along hidden paths, positioning them just so for a trap. A woman would place straw and hay to cover holes in the ground, making them invisible to the soldiers. An older man, retired from farming, sharpened sticks and stakes for the pits the farmer had dug. Every villager played a small role, each task simple, yet together they became a silent army. The farmer instructed them quietly. He spoke in short sentences easy to understand. Do this. Here. Move slowly. Hide well. Watch the snow. He taught them how to be patient, how to anticipate the enemy, and how to act without being seen. Slowly, the villagers learned the farmer's methods. Their fear turned into determination. They were no longer helpless. The Soviets were unaware of this change. They returned to the village, expecting the same chaos as before, but this time, they would face more than one clever mind. Their confidence was still high. Soldiers laughed at the snow, joked about traps, and underestimated the village once again. The farmer observed them carefully. He directed the villagers from hidden spots in the forest, signaling with hand gestures, whispers, or small movements. A log would fall here, a pit would catch a soldier there. But now, multiple people were orchestrating these moves under his guidance. The traps were no longer isolated. They worked together like pieces of a chessboard, each action leading to the next. The first soldiers to enter the village that morning were caught by a combination of old traps and new ones. They stumbled over logs, slipped on icy patches, and fell into hidden pits. The farmer had positioned villagers to strike at the right moments, guiding them silently. One man threw a small stone to distract a soldier, while another pulled a rope that sent a soldier into the snow. Panic spread quickly. Soldiers shouted, tried to regroup, but they were surrounded by invisible forces. The officer leading them could not understand what was happening. Where are they?" he demanded, shouting orders. His men were falling into traps everywhere, some injured, some lost in the forest. Every step seemed dangerous. The village itself had become a battlefield, alive with unseen defenders. The villagers, hidden safely, watched and participated. Their fear had turned to courage. They realized that even simple tools, rocks, sticks, ropes, logs, could defeat a trained army if used wisely. Under the farmer's guidance, they moved with precision, each action planned to cause maximum confusion. By midday, dozens of soldiers were trapped, struggling, or retreating. The officer's face was pale, his pride shattered. He had sent 100 men into the village, expecting an easy victory. Now he faced a force he could not see and could not understand. Each soldier who fell was a blow to his confidence, and each step forward brought more danger. The farmer, observing from the edge of the forest, smiled quietly. He did not boast. He had trained the villagers well, teaching them patience, observation, and timing. Together they were no longer a simple farming community. They had become a shadow army, invisible, clever, and deadly in their own way. As the day wore on, the Soviets realized they had underestimated the villagers. Soldiers were tangled in ropes, slipping into snow pits, and avoiding what seemed like ordinary paths, which were now traps. They could not see the people guiding these traps, but they could feel the danger in every step. The officer shouted furiously, trying to maintain order, but chaos had taken control. By evening, the surviving soldiers retreated once again, battered and confused. Their morale was broken. They had encountered more than traps. They had encountered the village itself, guided by a quiet farmer and now supported by the people he had trained. Fear had replaced their confidence. The villagers, for the first time in weeks, dared to step outside. They looked at their small homes and snowy fields with pride and amazement. One woman whispered to her child, "We are safe, because of him. And now, because of us." The farmer nodded quietly from the shadows, knowing they had learned well. He did not need thanks or praise. Action and preparation were reward enough. That night, the farmer walked through the village, checking the traps and ensuring everything was ready for the next attack. He spoke quietly to the villagers who had helped. "Good work. Rest. Tomorrow, we will do it again." Each nod, each silent acknowledgement strengthened their resolve. The Soviets, back at their city base, reported the disaster again. Officers were panicked and confused. "It is not one man," one admitted reluctantly. "It is many. They are working together. We cannot understand them. We are losing to farmers." The farmer, meanwhile, prepared for what would come next. He knew the Soviets would return with greater force, expecting retaliation. But he also knew the villagers were ready, their courage matched only by their cunning. Together they would face whatever came with intelligence, patience, and courage. The quiet farmer had grown into a leader. The villagers, once terrified and helpless, were now a silent, clever army. And the Soviets had yet to see the full power of their unity. The air was sharp and bitter that morning, carrying the scent of snow and fear. The village stood silent, blanketed in white as if waiting for a storm. But this time the storm was not the weather. It was the Red Army itself. The Soviets had returned, larger, stronger, and angrier than ever. Hundreds of soldiers marched down the road toward the village, guns gleaming, faces cold and determined. They were led by the senior officer, humiliated by the repeated failures, desperate to crush the shadow that had made fools of his men. The villagers watched from their hidden positions, hearts pounding. Children were tucked safely away, and women moved quietly among the houses, ready to aid the traps. Even the elders, though trembling, carried sticks and rocks, prepared to follow the farmer's instructions. For the first time, the entire village was part of the plan. The farmer stood at the edge of the forest, surveying the approaching army. He did not flinch, though he knew the battle would be fierce. His mind mapped every possible movement. Every path the soldiers could take, every blind spot, every hidden trap was accounted for. This was the culmination of months of preparation, intelligence, and patience. The first group of soldiers entered the village cautiously. The farmer signaled to his team. Logs were pushed down hills, snow-covered pits revealed themselves at the right moment, and tripwires sent men tumbling into hidden ditches. Confusion spread instantly. The soldiers shouted, fired their guns, but the traps were everywhere. Every move they made was anticipated. Then came the barns. The farmer had rigged several of them to collapse if disturbed. Soldiers trying to take cover found themselves under falling beams and straw bales. Smoke filled the air as small fires, set carefully beforehand, forced the invaders out of cover and into the snow where more traps awaited. The officer screamed orders, trying to regroup his men. But each decision was anticipated. A group would move to help, only to find themselves caught in another trap. A small creek, frozen on the surface but weak underneath, swallowed boots and legs, sending soldiers slipping and sliding helplessly. Panic was spreading through the army like wildfire. The villagers moved silently, guided by the farmer. A woman dropped a rock to distract a soldier. Another pulled a rope that sent a man into a snow pit. Each action was small but perfectly timed. The soldiers could not see who was behind it, but they felt the danger in every step. Their confidence shattered, fear began to dominate their minds. The farmer moved along the forest line, signaling his people, checking traps and adjusting them as needed. His calmness contrasted sharply with the chaos below. He did not attack directly. He did not need to. His strategy was simple: control the battlefield, guide the enemy, and let their own mistakes destroy them. Hours passed and the Red Army was in total disarray. Soldiers were trapped, injured, and retreating in small groups, only to stumble into other traps. The officer, furious and desperate, tried to order a final charge, but his men no longer listened. Fear had replaced courage. Every direction seemed dangerous. Every sound was a threat. By late afternoon, the battlefield was a scene of chaos. Snow mixed with footprints, fallen logs, broken branches, and injured soldiers. The village itself remained largely untouched. The quiet farmer and his people had turned the terrain into their weapon. No cannon, no tank, no numbers could overcome clever traps, intelligence, and determination. The villagers, once terrified, began to move more confidently, helping carry logs, adjust tripwires, and guide soldiers into traps. They had learned from the farmer. They understood patience, observation, and precision. Together they had become an invisible army. As night fell, the officer finally called a retreat. The remaining soldiers limped away, beaten not just in body but in spirit. Their pride was destroyed. Hundreds of men had been trapped, injured, and humiliated by a single farmer and a small village. The quiet man had proven that courage, intelligence, and preparation were more powerful than brute strength. The villagers emerged cautiously from their hiding spots. They looked around at the snow-covered fields, the collapsed traps, and the distant retreat of the soldiers. They whispered in awe, realizing that their survival had been secured not by luck or the army, but by one man's mind and their own courage. The farmer walked through the village slowly, checking each trap one last time. He spoke quietly to his people. "We did well. Rest. The danger is gone, for now." He did not boast. He did not celebrate. His satisfaction was silent, knowing that the village was safe, and the Soviets had learned a lesson they would never forget. That night, the village was alive with whispers and quiet admiration. The farmer remained at the edge of the forest, staring at the snowy horizon. He knew the war was far from over. Other soldiers would come, stronger and more determined. But he also knew something powerful. Courage, intelligence, and unity could overcome any army. One man, clever and patient, had turned a small village into an undefeatable fortress. One quiet farmer had defeated hundreds of soldiers with nothing but his mind, traps, and the courage he inspired in others. And the Soviets would never see him the same way again. The sun rose slowly over the quiet village, casting pale light on snow-covered roofs and fields. The battle was over. The Soviets had retreated, their pride shattered, their numbers reduced. The village had survived, untouched by the army that had marched in with confidence and guns. But the story of how it happened would never be fully told, except in whispers among the villagers. The quiet farmer walked through his village, inspecting the fields and traps one last time. The snow had covered footprints and marks, hiding the evidence of their clever defense. Pits were filled, tripwires removed, and logs returned to their places. Everything looked ordinary once again, as if nothing had happened. Yet those who had survived knew the truth. Villagers emerged from their homes cautiously, eyes wide with awe. Children ran to peek at the frozen fields, women and men moved quietly to check on neighbors, and the elderly shook their heads in disbelief. The farmer had not only protected them, he had inspired them. They had fought alongside him in spirit, learning courage, patience, and cleverness. The farmer said little. He had no desire for glory, no need for recognition. His satisfaction was quiet, found in the safety of the people he had protected. He had done what he needed to do. He had used intelligence, knowledge of the land, and careful planning to defeat an army, and he had taught his people how to do the same. The Soviets, far away in their city, were confused and humiliated. Reports of the village's defense spread like wildfire, leaving officers shaken. "How could a single farmer and a small village defeat hundreds of our soldiers?" they asked, unable to understand. The word of this shadow in the snow traveled through the ranks. A man with no weapons, no army, and no uniform, yet more powerful than many. Back in the village, life slowly returned to normal. Children played in the snow, women tended to their homes, and men returned to their farms. Yet a new spirit lingered among them. They were no longer helpless, no longer afraid. They had seen courage and cleverness triumph over brute force. They had learned that even ordinary people, guided by intelligence and bravery, could face the strongest enemies. The farmer returned to his barn, feeding his animals quietly. He looked out over the fields, now calm and peaceful. The snow reflected the early morning light, and he allowed himself a small smile. The village was safe. He had done what seemed impossible. And yet, he remained the same quiet man who had walked among them for years, unnoticed and unassuming. A few villagers approached him, bringing gifts of food and warmth. They whispered thanks, admiration, and awe. The farmer nodded quietly, accepting nothing openly. Words were not needed. The victory, the protection, and the lessons he had taught were enough. The villagers would remember even if the world beyond never knew his name. Years later, the story of the quiet farmer became a legend among nearby villages. Children heard whispers of the man who had outwitted an army with nothing but cleverness and courage. Travelers spoke of a shadow in the snow who struck fear into soldiers. But in the village itself, he remained ordinary, tending his farm, walking quietly among his people, a hero unseen by the world. And yet, his legacy was clear. The villagers had learned that intelligence, preparation, and unity could overcome any force. The lessons of the farmer became part of their lives. They taught their children, they remembered the courage of one man who had stood against hundreds. They understood that true power was not in weapons or numbers, but in patience, cleverness, and bravery. The snow continued to fall softly that evening, covering the fields in white once more. The village was safe, silent, and proud. And in the quiet, the farmer walked slowly to the edge of the forest, watching the horizon. Somewhere beyond, armies would rise, battles would come, but he was ready. The lessons of the past were strong, and the people he had inspired were no longer helpless. He was just a farmer. A quiet man with no army, no uniform, and no fame. Yet for 100 days he had been the nightmare of 505 soldiers. And in the hearts of the villagers, he would remain a hero forever. A shadow in the snow, cleverer than any army, braver than any soldier, and stronger than anyone imagined. The village slept peacefully that night. The Soviets would never forget the lesson. And the farmer? He returned to his simple life, knowing that courage, intelligence, and unity had won the day.